sharing your evening with me. I am going to try and keep it to under an hour and a half with time for questions. And if at any point you want to ask a question, please feel free to unmute yourself. Please feel free to write a comment in the chat box. I'll try my best to keep an eye on the chat. If I don't see your question, please shout and let me know, because I think it would be nice to hear from your perspectives. Some of the people who are joining us this evening will have some experience as GAP volunteers. Other people will be brand new to our charity, but you all have worthwhile perspectives and experiences to bring to this training. And it's a little strange for me to be doing this because I don't think I've done it since last July. Normally we would do this volunteer training 4 times a year, and I really enjoy doing it and getting to meet all the wonderful volunteers within our community, because we're just so grateful for your input. Anyone who has even volunteered once with Galway Autism Partnership will know how vital the role of volunteer is. It's a really hands-on role, and you'll be immediately aware that having the additional people there, their impact is so important to the kids and the young people that we support through our clubs and our camps. And mainly today, we're going to be talking about volunteering in the upcoming summer camps. So I'm hoping to see some of your faces over the next few months in our camps. So I'm just going to get started straight away. Let's see, technical difficulties there. And before we begin, you may have already noticed that when I'm speaking, I say autistic people, autistic children, autistic young people. And that might seem a little bit different to what you're used to, depending on your experiences within the disability communities. And the reason we at GAP would say autistic people, autistic children, autistic person, is because our members have asked us to use identity first language. And if this is a completely new concept to you, don't worry. So person first would mean a person with autism, a person with a disability, whereas identity first language is when the person chooses to identify by their disability or their diagnosis first. So I am an autistic person. It's actually very common in the deaf community as well. So to the best of my knowledge, the autistic and the deaf community prefer identity first language, and a lot of other disability communities prefer person first. And I think this little comic does a really nice way of explaining it, because most autistic adults prefer that type of language because they really feel that their autism is such an integral part of their identity. Without their autism, they would not be who they are. And I've had it very accurately described as saying, you know, you wouldn't describe yourself as a person with Irishness or a person with tallness or a person with gayness. You would describe yourself as a tall Irish gay person. And it actually kind of, once I heard that, it all clicked for me. And of course, for every rule, there's an exception. Not every autistic adult prefers identity first language, but our members have specifically asked that we use identity first language, and we want to do as much as we can possibly do to validate and to recognize their wishes. So I just wanted to start off and mention that before we continue, just in case anyone was a little bit uncomfortable, I suppose, with me saying autistic people. And I slip up all the time. I often make the mistake, and I would use the person first language myself. So just a little bit of info about Galway Autism Partnership, and then I swear I'm going to move on to the more fun, exciting stuff where we talk about our summer camps. So the charity itself was founded in 2011 by a group of proactive parents and autistic adults to address the shortage of services that were available for the autistic community and families in Galway City and County. Our mission is to improve the quality of life experience for autistic people and their families by providing and facilitating quality peer support, information, and this is where our summer camps and your volunteering comes into play, our social activities, as well as training and education. We currently do not receive multi-annual state funding. We will occasionally get grants here and there that keep us up and running. So we really rely heavily on the assistance of our volunteers to be able to continue the work that we do. We currently support around between 180 to 200 families. There could be anything up to 100 children in our summer camps. And we have a very small staff team, so we really rely on the input and involvement of volunteers for all the work that we do, but primarily our camps and our clubs. And we provide support for autistic people and their families living in Galway City and County through peer support, information and education, including raising awareness, events and activities, and our clubs and camps. So that's Galway Autism Partnership in a nutshell. And in case I didn't introduce myself, my name is Aisling and I'm the coordinator of Galway Autism Partnership. I think I sometimes take it for granted that people know me from the emails or the phone calls, but just in case, if I'm a brand new face to you, you'll get to know me pretty well, any involvement with Galway Autism Partnership. Our staff basically consists of me, I'm the only full-time member of staff, my colleague Mary, who works in finance, and my other colleague Salma, who is our administrative assistant. So we're a small, tight-knit team here at Galway Autism Partnership, but we're very busy. And in case anyone is very new to the autistic community, I'd like to spend a little time talking to you about what exactly autism is. And even if autism isn't a brand new or an unknown concept, I would like to explain to you how Galway Autism Partnership considers autism. We don't like to talk about autism in terms of a series of impairments or symptoms. We describe autism as a neurological difference that a person is born with, and each autistic person experiences their autism differently. So again, to explain that a different way, autism is a type of brain wiring that processes information differently by altering how nerve cells and their synapses connect and organize this information. And autistic people actually have more synapses. And yes, last night we actually had a presenter on from America. It was very exciting. The autistic OT, Sarah Salvaggi Hernandez is her name. And she was able to give us the American Occupational Therapists Association definition of autism. And I felt that it was very, very inclusive and very affirmative. It basically acknowledged that autistic people think, learn, and experience the world differently. And that is really the most simple way of explaining and understanding autism as a non-autistic person. Autism is characterized by how a person thinks, how a person communicates, how a person socializes and has relationships, and also nearly all autistic people have very passionate, specific interests. And if you're coming from a background of psychology, healthcare, maybe childcare, chances are that you're familiar with something called the triad of impairments, these three areas or categories of symptoms to describe autism. At GAP, we don't talk about a triad of impairments because I don't know anyone who wants to be described by their impairments. People are whole and complete no matter what, whether they have a disability or a condition, and everyone has challenges and everyone has strengths. And autism is a natural progression of that, the amazing variation in the human mind, which is also known as neurodiversity. So our minds all work differently. Autistic people's brain work differently than non-autistic people. And again, if you're in any way familiar about autism, chances are you will have probably heard a few of these myths. And these myths vary from being a bit nasty to downright harmful and offensive and actually put autistic people at risk, which is another part of why it's really important that we have people like you in the community who want to get involved with Galway Autism Partnership. The way I see it, if you're expressing an interest in volunteering with Galway Autism Partnership, you are an ally to the autistic community and you want to improve the quality of life for autistic people. And we can do that by changing our own way of thinking about autism and also the way the people around us think and talk about autism. So, and I'd just like to say as well, you know, I grew up in a family with autistic people and I probably believed some of these myths up until meeting somebody who challenged these myths for me. So there's absolutely nothing wrong with, you know, having made mistakes. We all make mistakes. It's very human. There's absolutely nothing wrong with believing one thing and having our minds changed when we are able to discover new information. That's what makes a good learner. So yeah, if you have believed one of these in the past or continue to believe it, don't worry, because I was right there with you. So it's things like we would have heard, like autistic people are unable to empathize with others. Well, we know that's not true, because we know there are a lot of beautiful autistic people in meaningful, compassionate relationships with family members, friends. And we know that a lot of autistic people work in caring professions like medicine, nursing, doctors, therapy, counselors. So just because a person isn't openly or outwardly autistic, it does not mean that they're not autistic. So there are autistic teachers, there are autistic lecturers, counselors, therapists, doctors, nurses, you name it, there are autistic people in that profession. And I think you do require a certain degree of empathy to work in those, as well as to maintain healthy relationships. Autistic people can't communicate. Well, that's not true. There's nobody on this earth that can't communicate. And occasionally, autistic people are non-verbal. So I think it's around maybe 15 to 30% of autistic people. I will have to double check that statistic. I'm not sure, but a certain percentage of autistic people communicate non-verbally. They might use signs, they might use an app, they might use alternative communication like use of an iPad or their phone, they might type, they might write, they may communicate purely through gestures or noises. And all of those forms of communication are totally valid. We are very, very much in the neurotypical verbal world. We are very biased towards verbal communication, but goodness knows sometimes we should just kind of quieten down and learn to listen to other people and accept other forms of communication, because we can learn a lot once we stop pushing people to communicate like us and start accepting their preferred form of communication. Autism can be cured. That's another big no-no. Autism can't be cured. It's a lifelong way of being. And autistic people do not like generally the idea of being cured. Again, it's part of their identity. Would you like to be cured of your ethnicity or your nationality? Chances are you would not like that. And when people talk about curing autism, it's very invalidating and dehumanizing to autistic people. We heard of things like autistic people have no sense of humor and are socially awkward. We can probably thank shows like The Big Bang Theory or films like Rain Man for myths like that. Autistic people are loners and would prefer to be left alone. Certainly not in my experience. Autistic people are people, and like everyone else, they are individuals. Some people are more drawn to socializing and having loads of relationships, and some people are happy with just a small handful of good quality relationships. Exact same for autistic people. We hear things like some autistic children get away with too much at home. That's why their behavior is difficult. They're spoiled. They're allowed kind of the run of the house. And that's not true. What I do know is that it can be very challenging to raise an autistic child. So I'm never going to judge a parent for how they choose to actually raise and parent their child. Everyone does the best to the best of their ability with what they have available. You might have heard that everyone with autism has an intellectual disability. That's not true. So I think it's estimated that maybe 30 to 50%, depending on what study you look at, 30 to 50% of autistic people also have an intellectual disability. But no matter what study you're looking at, either at least half or maybe the majority of autistic people do not have an intellectual disability. And at GAP, we have young people and teenagers that have dual diagnosis. They are autistic, they might have intellectual disability. We have autistic people that have no other diagnosis. We have autistic people with other diagnoses, things like ADHD, dyspraxia, dyslexia, Down syndrome. Like I said, we support hundreds of children, so we see a huge amount of variation. And then this last one here, autistic people have rigid or restricted interests. There's a tiny little grain of truth in that one. Autistic people generally are very passionate about their favorite things, their favorite hobbies, their favorite activities. But when it's medicalized and it talks about people having rigid or restricted interests, again, that's really harmful and really negative. And it's just inherently dehumanizing of autistic people. I am personally, I'm obsessed with podcasts, listening to crime podcasts. And if somebody said to me, oh, you have a rigid or restricted interest in crime podcasts, I would say, well, actually, I have a hobby. I like to listen to podcasts, and I'm very passionate about learning about my favorite subject. And I would think, what's wrong with this person? Why are they talking to me like I'm in a test tube? It's the same. Autistic people don't want to be poked and prodded and examined. If they're really passionate about something, whether it's Lego or the solar system or a certain game or a certain TV show, that just is their favorite thing, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's just how people are. We tend to be really passionate about what we like. So before I go on, I'm just going to stop share and just going to check the chat to see how we're getting on. Okay, everyone can hear. Does anyone have any questions at this point? I know I haven't been talking for that long, but I'm probably trying to cram in quite a lot in a small time. So if anyone has any questions, please feel free to pop it in the chat, or you can unmute yourself. That's no problem. And if not, I will just jump right back in. And I'll also take this opportunity just to say we will break for about 5 minutes at 8 o'clock. So I'll keep an eye on the time and I'll let you know when we're taking our break. Okay, so I don't see any questions at the moment, so I'm just going to go back to our presentation. Also, even if you don't have questions, if there's anything that you disagree with, or maybe you have heard differently, or you have some new information, please share that with me as well, okay? Great, okay, so where were we? So who is autistic? And actually, maybe a better question would be, what does autism look like? Well, trick question. It doesn't look like anything. I think a lot of you already know that. Autism is what's considered an invisible disability, and that means there are no apparent signs to an onlooker. So I could do the question I ask when I go into schools, and I could say, who in this picture is autistic? But I think you probably all know my tricks. Everyone in this picture is autistic. So on the top left, we have Adam Harris, who's the CEO of As I Am, which is Ireland's national autism charity. They do a lot of work in terms of advocacy, education, and awareness raising. Adam Harris set up that charity when he was 17, while he was doing his leaving cert. So as a person who works in the charity sector, I have huge admiration for Adam. And he's just such a nice person as well. He is a pleasure to talk to learn. If you ever get an opportunity to see him go speak, he is incredible. And when I hear people talking about autistic people don't have good social skills, I say, well, have you ever watched Adam Harris speaking? Because that man can work a room like no one else. He takes off his shoes and he walks around in his socks, and he's very, very, well-spoken, very charming, very, very able to get his point across in a very friendly and warm manner. And then in this top middle picture, we have Daryl Hannah. People who are a little bit, maybe, born maybe in the 90s, you'll probably remember Daryl Hannah from the likes of Splash or Kill Bill or any of those films. And Daryl Hannah is an actress, and it wasn't, she wasn't openly autistic when she was making movies, but she actually credits her autism as being the reason why acting comes so naturally to her. So Daryl Hannah said, all throughout her life, she felt different. She felt like she couldn't connect with others, and she had to pretend to be somebody else. And the process of pretending to, or acting in a non-autistic way to conform or to fit in, that actually has its own term. It's called masking. So masking is like a form of acting, But masking is also really harmful to autistic people and really detrimental to their mental health. It's basically them saying, okay, I have to pretend to be someone who I'm not in order to fit in order to have friends, get a job, have a relationship. And that means society doesn't like me for who I am. And you can imagine what that does to a person's mental health and well-being. On the top right, we have Dan Harmon, who's the creator of shows like Rick and Morty and Community. So you might be aware of that, either of those shows. Dan Harmon, again, was diagnosed later in life when he was researching a role for a character in the show Community, Abed, if anyone is familiar with the show. And he knew he wanted the character to be autistic or have autistic traits. And the more research he did, the more he realized how that was mirrored in his own experience, his life and growing up. And funnily enough, a lot of adults who come to their autism diagnosis later in life, they will either see it reflected in a media character that they feel portrays somebody like them, or alternatively, their child will be getting assessed and having a diagnosis, and they'll go, well, I was like that when I was a child. And then the penny just drops and they they do a little bit of research. If they're lucky and they can actually afford to have an assessment done as an adult, they can go then, and then they may get diagnosed as an adult. So it's quite common for parents to get diagnosed after their child has been diagnosed. So on the bottom left here, we have a UK-based artist called Stephen Wiltshire. Stephen Wiltshire is one of these amazing creative people. He is very soft-spoken, does not communicate verbally a lot, but his chosen form of expression is art. He does these beautiful pen and ink drawings of these cityscapes, and he was very late to develop language. He was drawing long before he was speaking, and he credits his love of art and actually having to access art materials. I need paper, I need pens, with bringing on his communication. And then in the bottom middle, we have a really lovely lady called Carly Fleischman. Carly is an American presenter and autistic advocate. Carly is actually entirely nonverbal. She communicates using an app on her iPad. So if you want a great laugh and to see something really interesting, you should check her out interviewing Channing Tatum. She's very funny, very, very charming, very witty. And she interviews celebrities, politicians, musicians, exclusively using her iPad. And then on our bottom right, we have the very well-known Greta Thunberg, who I think we all know Greta. She's been doing incredible work in terms of environmental advocacy and activism. And again, Greta credits her autism as being the reason why she is so driven. She cannot rest until she does her work. And there was a time in Greta's life when she was very young, I think she was around maybe 8 or 9, when she was very ill. She had very poor mental health. She was suffering from anorexia and extremely anxious and depressed. And by focusing her energies and her efforts into climate activism and channeling the kind of hyper focus that her autism allowed her, she was able to find purpose in life, meaning, and a drive to get better. Because if she wasn't well, she couldn't be an activist, she couldn't protest. So she started to nourish her body and her mind because she found well-being, and so it's just amazing. So that's an example there of how important an autistic person's special interest can be to them. And actually, I would say everyone in this picture, they have been able to harness their special interest and make it work for them to get a really successful career out of it. Somebody who I didn't include on this presentation is actually Elon Musk, who came out as autistic only last month. I didn't include him on this presentation because I find him to be quite a divisive figure. You either love him or you hate him. He's a bit Marmite. But regardless of, whether he's the best thing to happen to capitalism or the worst thing to happen to mankind, he is autistic and he has been very successful. His brain is, I think whether you like him or you don't like him, you can't deny that his brain is pretty amazing. So again, it just goes to show autistic people are everywhere. And these are examples of well-known autistic people. But more likely you're just going to encounter a normal autistic person at work, at school, at college, in your neighborhood, in your community. They're not going to be actors or activists or, you know, the second richest man in the world. They're going to be children, neighbors, co-workers, because 1 in 64 people will receive an autism diagnosis in their life. And 1 in 64 is pretty huge. And the way I always think about it is, you know, if you're walking down Shop Street on a busy day, busy Saturday, you are going to notice that there are people walking on Shop Street with visible disabilities. You're going to notice wheelchair users, people using crutches or sticks. You might notice a blind person. You might notice someone wearing a hearing aid. You're going to notice these visible disabilities, but then stop and remember that invisible disabilities are actually 3 times more common. For every one person you see with a visible disability, whether it's a person using a wheelchair or like some kind of appliance, there are another 3 people who you can't tell at all. So autistic people are literally everywhere. And our membership is composed of autistic people, young and old, and their family. So the youngest we would support in our clubs would be 3 right up to adulthood. And in our summer camps, our clubs, I'll explain this later, but our clubs are separated by age. And before we, you know, take on this challenge of 24 summer camps over the course of 2 months, it's important that we stop for a moment and reflect on the impact that COVID-19 has had on our members. So the autistic community happened to be a very vulnerable community in Ireland and all over the world. Financially, they are some of the most vulnerable people you will ever meet, families included. Emotionally, very vulnerable. They would have a much higher incidence of physical and mental health illnesses and issues. I could go into statistics about average life expectations. It would blow your mind, but I think that is information for another presentation. But suffice to say, autistic people have a much harder time of it than non-autistic people. So we did a survey about 2 weeks ago, and amongst the questions we asked people, what has the impact of COVID-19 been on your child's development? Please include details relating to their physical, emotional, mental and social development or any regression that they may have experienced. And we were dismayed but not shocked by the results that came back, because Galway Autism Partnership has been active throughout the entire pandemic. We may have stopped our in-person activities, but our office has been working. We never closed. So we've been taking phone calls, emails, Zoom calls from our members, and we've been hearing about what people are experiencing. This survey just allowed us to summarize it. So you'll see this is a word cloud of all the words that were mentioned. Regression was mentioned over and over again. So many people talked about their child's loss of skills. It wasn't just things like, you know, fine motor skills or academic skills. It was that as well, but it was primarily social skills. You'll see that lit up there too. So many people said, okay, homeschooling was hard, but my child missed their friends so much. They missed their swimming. They missed seeing the people, their cousins and their friends in a different town, how hard that was for them. And their social skills really regressed and their mental health was really, really affected. We saw things like isolation, extremely difficult. School has been tough on kids all over the world, and it has been particularly tough on kids with disability. So there are some children that just were not able to use Zoom to do homeschooling. So for effectively 6 months or longer, they were going without any connection, without any schooling. Then the return to school was such a massive difficulty. If you've ever heard about autistic people that they can struggle with change or transitions, that was massive during the pandemic. So yeah, like I said, the report, what people were telling us, we weren't surprised because we've been hearing it all along, but it was really alarming to see it all collected onto one page. and really upsetting too. And that is where we come in. Me, you, our volunteers. We basically, I know it sounds a little bit cheesy to say this, but I want to make this summer magical for our members. And I want to really help them through the camps and the clubs that we do. And I don't think it is an overstatement to actually say that connection and clubs can improve a person's mental health. When we talk about mental health, we immediately think of counselling, therapy, medication. Interventions don't have to be that intensive. It could be something as simple as attending a club, making a friend, and having a really good time. 1 week out of the summer, you wouldn't believe the impact that it has on the children. Parents will still call me up and say, my child still talks about the camp that you did 2 years ago in the walled garden. They still talk about the animation club that you did. They loved the Lego group. It's just, I'm not tooting my own horn because this isn't my work. This is the work that our volunteers and our facilitators do. So you will be amazed by the impact that your involvement will have on these children. And I'm not trying to sell this to you. I think you'll know as soon as you come in and meet the kids, the impact that this is going to have on them. You'll see it in their faces. So we do throughout the year, we do weekend and after school clubs. They have had to all be online up until April, and then we started doing outdoor clubs. We do summer and holiday camps, so we're delighted that we're going to be getting back to our in-person summer camps starting this Monday coming. We do adult social clubs, and then we also do special interest clubs. So as I said earlier, a lot of autistic people have special interests they're really passionate about. What's more fun for an autistic person than meeting other children that they have that in common with and just geeking out over their favorite thing? So we do clubs at the moment. We do Lego, art, dance and music, fit and funky. It's like a little exercise club. We do a really popular gaming club that has been running online it was every Friday, and now it's every Wednesday throughout the pandemic. The same kids have been coming into it for a year, and they're going to meet in person at the summer camp. And we also do a weekly club called Like Minds, which is just about getting kids who think like each other together and getting them to enjoy being in one another's company and sharing their special interest. I didn't include it here, but we're running animation camps in July, and the demand has been amazing. Those animation camps are really popular. So as I said, we break up our clubs, or we kind of categorize them by age. And I suppose every child is different. We might have a 4-year-old who is very mature and could easily hold their own against an 8-year-old. Or we might have a 6-year-old who maybe developmentally they would be closer to a younger child. So we really see a huge variety in our camps. I really love working with the young kids because they are so easy to please. And if anything does upset them, it's like water off a duck's back. They just bounce right back and they're so happy. Similar with the kids, actually, even though the kids can be a bit more outspoken, I suppose would be the word. So the kids are 7 to 12. This is our biggest cohort of children. Most of our members are in this age category. And like I said, we support people of every ability, different strengths, different needs. We have great fun. This little man in the orange shirt, he's a lot old. That picture is very old because he's a lot bigger now. That's a few years old. But this young man actually won't let his mum or dad or sister come into the camp with him because he says, it's my camp, get out. So that gives you an idea of how much independence these camps give these children. And I just think that's wonderful. I think you couldn't get a better review than that, than him saying, like, I feel safe here. I don't need you hanging around. And we also do our teenage clubs, and we have a lot of teenagers this year as well. So I've been with GAP nearly 5 years. So a lot of the people who were in the kids clubs are now transitioning into the teen clubs, and it's weird for me, but again, a lot of fun. And I think in this picture, they're doing some kind of engineering activity. I think it was an egg drop. And also as well, just to mention, We do occasionally do adult clubs as well. We certainly have less adult members, but there are enough of them that we occasionally do clubs where there is demand. And again, you know, I talk to our volunteers pretty much on a daily basis when people are new to the charity, and I get to hear what their concerns are, what they're a little bit worried about, and that's fine. Being anxious in a new situation is such a human thing. You know, it would be strange if we weren't a little bit anxious in a new scenario. So before you volunteer, these are some of the questions that I hear commonly, or some of the statements that I hear. So I hear things like, I've never worked with anyone with autism. I don't know what to expect. And that's true. You don't know what to expect. I could talk to you for 10 hours, and what you learn talking to me, you might not see any evidence of that when you meet an autistic child in our camps, because every autistic person is totally unique. So we're all on a level playing field. We don't know what to expect, and that's fine. We have to have an open mind and kind of, I suppose, be ready for anything. You know, some people say, I don't know if I'd be any good with the younger children. I'd feel more comfortable with the adults or teenagers, or maybe the opposite. Some people might say, I think I'd be more comfortable working with the younger children rather than the adults. And I always say, you know, that's fine. Tell us what you're good at. Like, you know, it would be hypocritical for me to say, oh, autistic people have strengths and we should work to their strengths. And then for me to turn around to our volunteers and say, oh, just work with the people that you don't feel like you're best working with, you know, because I really believe when people focus on their strengths, we get the best out of them. I love working with the younger kids. They're my favorite. I'm always scared that the teenagers will think I'm a complete dweeb. I'm really worried about what they think of me. And tomorrow I have to deliver an online presentation to a group of teenagers, and I will be sweating buckets. I'm so nervous about it. But they've never been anything other than nice to me. They're actually really nice. So I think I'm just paranoid. Some people say, I've never changed a nappy in my life. Okay, so some, not all of the children that attend our camps will need assistance with things like toileting, nappy changing, personal hygiene. Not all of them, but definitely some will. And I always say to our volunteers, if this is something that you feel so uncomfortable with and you've never done it, ask a facilitator, the leader of the camp. Ask if they can take over and you can observe. And it's the same, maybe it's something, it doesn't necessarily have to be personal hygiene. It might be supporting a child in distress. If you go, I've never done this before and I'm worried I'm going to mess it up, ask the facilitator to step in. I'll have a better idea of what to expect once I get started. Absolutely true. That's it. I love when I'm interviewing volunteers and they say, I say, any questions? And they go, not at the moment, but I probably will when I get started. I love to hear that because it's realistic. You know, we know like there are going to be bumps along the road, but as long as you feel that you can ask for support and help, that's what we want to know. I worry that I'll be no help if a child is upset or distressed. And what if I upset them? I understand this one. I used to feel like this, like, what if I actually cause a child to have a meltdown? What if I trigger them? What if I make them cry? What if I can't calm them down? And one, if you're thinking those things, you're in the right place because you care, you're empathetic, you're compassionate. And two, you're not the reason a child is upset. You're not the reason a child is having a meltdown. You might be enforcing a very healthy, normal boundary, like you can't walk on the road, you can't pick up a bee, you can't run into the ocean. All of those are real life examples. They happen in our camps. You know, you can't do these things or you will get hurt or other people will get hurt. And if a child gets upset, maybe has a meltdown or a tantrum, I'll talk a little bit about the difference between those two things. You know, you might feel, oh no, I caused that child to cry. But no, that's just a totally natural response to a normal boundary, and you are helping to make that child safe. And listen, it's okay to cry. That's just a way to express an emotion, you know, but it's no one's fault. And even if a child has a epic meltdown and they have a really difficult day, you don't know what is going on underneath the surface. You don't know if that child slept poorly the night before, if they have a little bit of a tummy ache, if they had a bit of a disagreement with their brother or sister, if they feel like nobody's listening to them. There could be 10 things, and you saying that they can't have an extra sweet might be the straw that broke the camel's back, but that is not your fault. And then another thing people say is, I don't know if I'll be able to be firm with the children or strict. And then people say, well, what if I'm too firm, you know? And that's kind of an extension of what if I upset them? Listen, the only way to learn that is through experience, getting to know the children, getting to know their boundaries and your boundaries. You know, I know some of the children quite well at CAP, and then there's others I'm not that familiar with. And I know that there are children that if we're out and about and they ask me to buy a packet of sweets, I can go, are you crazy? I don't have the money for your sweets. And they'll laugh it off and just get along with things. And then I know there's other children who I need to take a much more gentle approach with them and explain to them that I can't buy their sweets. So you get to know what's the right approach with the children when you work with them. And before we go into any more depth about this, I hope this works. First and foremost, this is about kind of a little bit, a 2.5 minute long video. I think it really effectively demonstrates what it can be like to experience a sensory overload as an autistic person. Obviously, as a non-autistic person, I will never be able to fully understand that experience, but I think this is the next best thing we can get. And I think this just does a wonderful job of explaining how scary it can be to be in an environment that is new and unknown, and how, despite people's best efforts to help us, sometimes they can be really difficult. So I'm just going to press play. Just write in the chat box if you can hear the sound once this gets started, if you don't mind. It's a bit blurry.
Just wait there 1 minute, I'm just going to get a ticket, okay?
Oh, sorry.
Just wait there 1 minute, I'm just going to get a ticket, okay? Just breathe. That's it, just deep breathing, calming down. Okay. Okay, see everything's fine now? Yeah? Right, let's go home.
So I'm just going to stop sharing for a moment. And if you wouldn't mind, if you want to just put in the chat box kind of how that made you feel, that experience, what was going through your head when you were kind of experiencing the perspective of that autistic child. Take your time and write it there in the chat box. very anxious, said Mary Moran. Yeah, I feel that way too. Also, I wanted to say the video is very blurry. If you go on YouTube, you can see a much higher definition. If you were to watch that video, you would think, oh my gosh, every autistic person needs to wear their glasses. So there's nothing wrong with autistic people's vision. That video was just poor quality. Very distressing and overwhelming. That's right. Yeah, Sheila, that's exactly how it feels. And the other thing is, there's kind of a partner video to that video available on YouTube where it shows what other people might be seeing. And in the video, it's just a little pale child just standing there quiet, looking terrified. But all of this is going on internally until everything just goes boom. And the lady in that video, we don't know if it's a mother or a friend or a teacher or, you know, a volunteer, but, you know, they were doing a really good job. They were, you know, life was happening. They were dropping their money. They were trying to get their parking ticket. They couldn't rush out. And, you know, they were trying to keep that child calm and regulated while trying to manage everything else that was going on. But they were, you know, it was really hard for them as well. So, you know, that could be your role as a volunteer. But they did everything right. They were reminding the child to breathe. They were kind of, you know, getting to their level. They were saying to that child, look at me, which for that child might be helpful. For a lot of autistic people, probably not. But the number one thing that they did was they got the child out of the situation. And 9 times out of 10, that is what is most helpful for a child in meltdown. So actually, Lorcan commented there, the child was sensitive to light, smell, and noise. Yeah, exactly. And you'll probably notice you could hear his breathing getting more challenged. You could nearly hear his heart rate going as well. So what we don't experience in the video is the sensory feeling or the taste or the smells that they might be experiencing. So there's so much going on there. But yeah, as I said, the lady in the video did a pretty good job of supporting that child. But the number one thing was she got him out of that scary situation. So I'll just continue. Thanks for your comments there, everyone. That was great. I'll just continue on. So yeah, this is kind of what we might be dealing with, a child who has come through a pandemic, who has been in and out of school, learning at home, spending maybe too much time with their brothers and sisters and mammies and daddies, and maybe can be quite anxious. And then they have that to deal with. So this summer, we want to make a summer camp experience that is safe, welcoming, fun, friendly, and supportive. And I personally believe that all GAP clubs and camps should be all of these things. But this year is so important. This is our Olympics, you know. This is what, like, we will all look back on this year, I believe, touch wood, and be really proud of the work we did in helping one of the most vulnerable communities during the pandemic. I'm not a nurse, I'm not a doctor, I can't administer vaccines, but I can do this, and so can you. So I want to talk a bit about the practicalities of volunteering with GAP. So everyone here today, the role that you would be involved in is as a volunteer club assistant. And I wanted to give a very clear breakdown of your responsibilities. And I know this might be a little dull, but it's good to know these in advance of volunteering. So number one, ensuring the safety and welfare of every child and every adult is maintained, watching out for them, supervising them. Supporting each person to meet their individual needs. And support is very different for everyone because everyone has very different support needs. Some children need help with toileting, personal hygiene. Some children might be completely independent there, but they might need assistance with things like play, social skills, sharing, turn taking, asking for help. All of those things are really important roles for a volunteer to be there and to be modeling those behaviours. Creativity. Sometimes we have kids who have amazing ideas, but they want to get that idea on paper or into Play-Doh, and they might look for your help with that. Communication. So we're not here to teach our children how to communicate, but we're here to facilitate communication. So we're going to give them opportunities to communicate, whether that's asking for what they want, like a drink or to use the toilet, or simple social communication like, hello, how are you? What's your favorite TV show? Things like that. Positive behaviour support. Some of the children that attend our camps can't attend mainstream camps because they have behaviours that challenge. And as volunteers, we are going to help them and support them to feel safe. And if they do have behaviours that challenge or meltdowns, we are going to support them through that so that they can continue to enjoy their camp experience. And always, everything we do, we're trying to promote independence, whether it means the 3-year-old puts their empty yogurt carton in the bin, or the teenager is able to fully complete a task without any help whatsoever. Those are different types of independence, but it's all on the same spectrum of independence. And volunteers work as part of a team with the assistance of the facilitator to create a safe, welcoming and fun environment. They will encourage our campers to try new things, get involved, take part in activities, and to interact in an appropriate manner with others. So, we are always trying to show children new things, new learning, new experiences, but we also know that new can be a little bit scary to autistic people. So how do we make the unknown known? And how do we make this new activity enjoyable for our children? We will support other volunteers and facilitators to run these clubs and camps. And part of that is maintaining a safe, comfortable and clean environment during and after clubs. So it's never been more important than it has been now. The use of hand sanitizer, PPE, cleaning up spills, spraying down, things like that. A really important role of the volunteer is providing feedback to the facilitators and to me on your experience. If there is something you feel can be done differently or can be done better, I want to hear about it. If there's things that you feel could be added or taken away from this training, I really want to know about it. And I'm not precious about it. I can take harsh criticism because I work with autistic people and they always tell me the truth. And also really important is the safeguarding, the protection and welfare of children and vulnerable adults. Because that's so important, we're going to spend a little bit more time of it after the break. A little bit more about the responsibilities. So as a volunteer in our camps, it's really important that you make the parent feel comfortable and relaxed when they're dropping their child off, because that's how our clubs run. The parents drop their children off, they get a little bit of a break, a little bit of respite, and the children enjoy a bit of independence. So we don't want parents who are anxious and that anxiety trickling down into their children who are then too anxious to enjoy their summer camps. But if you're confident and you say, hi, my name is Aisling and I'm volunteering with the club today, I'll be working with Louis today. That's really nice for parents. And we've heard from their feedback that they love to hear the names of the volunteers. They love to chat to you a little bit. They're really grateful and appreciative of the help. They know that these clubs do not work without you. So it is not lost on them that you're there helping their kids. The one thing I will say, though, is that as a volunteer, you won't be required to discuss sensitive information with a parent without the facilitator present. And just a kind of an idea of what sensitive information might be, it would most likely be something like an incident. So say if one child pushed another child and took their toy and maybe they got a little graze or a scratch. So we obviously would communicate an incident like that to a parent. But as a volunteer, you will not have to do that independently. You can be present for the conversation, but the facilitator will take the lead because ultimately that's their responsibility. So there's a couple of important things to know about our clubs. The 4 most important things, in my opinion, are reliability. If you are committed to a camp, please do all you can to attend. The schedule can be impaired or the camp might have to be cancelled if we are short volunteers, if we don't have an appropriate adult to child ratio. Now, I know more than anyone that life happens. There's emergencies, there's bereavements, there are people running late. and I am never going to get upset or angry with someone if they can't make it. But I do ask that people let me know in advance, either by email or a text to the Gap phone, because if you do let me know in advance, I can try and arrange cover. So like I said, please just let me know and do your best to attend if you can. Responsibility. So we want people volunteering in our camps who are responsible, you know, have a good head on their shoulders, who feel confident supporting children and young people. Enthusiasm. This is so important. You can have all the other skills, but if you're not enthusiastic, it'll go down like a lead balloon. The children want to have fun. They want to play with you. The children really love the volunteers. Actually, sometimes we find that the children want to play more with the volunteers than the other children. So they are ready to go. They want you there. So all I ask is that you meet them where they are at and get involved and play and follow their lead and have fun. And then consistency. So what does that actually mean? So it means that as a volunteer, you are making the unknown known. You are responding to that child in a consistent manner. So boundaries are there for a reason. We hold hands when we're going for a walk. We don't eat our food in the playroom. We don't push other children over. So if you are supervising a child and you see that they're behaving in a way that's not appropriate or they're very dysregulated, you as a volunteer are going to have a consistent response. Okay, we're not robots, we don't all act the same, but you're going to act in the best interest of the child and try to support them as best you can. So, well, I'm going to move next on to child protection and safeguarding. But before we do that, I'm going to stop sharing. If you please have any questions, just let me know. But I'm going to suggest that we take a 5-minute break. So it's just 1 minute past 8. If we want to come back just after 8:05, please go get tea, coffee, refreshments, whatever you need to do. Give yourself a little boost. I'll be here. I might turn off my camera, but if anyone has any questions or you want to talk to me, I'll be right here. I'm just going to grab a drink and that's it. So yeah, and let me know if you do have a question, just let me know. I'll put my camera back on. Thanks, guys. And if you do have any questions as well, you can pop them in the chat box. Okay, so we'll be back in 5 minutes. Now back to our presentation. So as I said, we're going to be talking about the very important topic of child protection and safeguarding. And I would like to say as well, we will be talking about topics like abuse and neglect. We're not going to go into anything in too much detail, but if you do feel like you need to take a moment or you need to step away, please do so. I know that this can be a very hard topic for a lot of people, understandably. So I just wanted to give that warning before we started. And before we do that, I will just touch briefly, when we do talk about the kind of risks that pose, there's a risk now that we did not have to talk about 2 years ago, which is COVID-19. This is just considered this kind of the most practical part of this volunteer training. this is a requirement that we have to have some form of COVID-19 induction training with our volunteers. So I will just try to go over this, not downplaying the significance and the importance of maintaining all the different types of protections and safeguards that we can do. And I think a lot of you will be very familiar with these, whether it's from work or just the community. So I am Galway Autism Partnership's COVID-19 compliance officer, which means I have the overall responsibility to ensure that we are complying with the regulations and the restrictions. As I said, we're a very small team, so that is why I am the compliance officer. And it is part of my responsibility to keep our volunteers and members safe. And we do that through strategies such as hand sanitizing or hand hygiene, respiratory hygiene, just coughing into our elbow, or sneezing if we need to do so, and then washing our hands, social distancing. And I'll talk a little bit more about how that can be a challenge in clubs. Basically, anyone who is volunteering with us, you will get sent to your email a brief but comprehensive COVID-19 information note. And we acknowledge that not every child and young person is capable of social distancing or wearing masks or even sufficiently washing their hands all the time. So that is why it's really important that as responsible adults that we take all the steps that we can do to protect ourselves and the people around us. So nearly, if we know that there are people who are vulnerable and will find it difficult to follow these restrictions, we need to really, really be careful in our behaviours and actions. Minimising contact. There's one child at GAP who one of his favourite things to do is list out all the people he's going to hug after the pandemic, which I just think is so sweet. And I'm not on the list, unfortunately. But unfortunately, during our summer camps, we are minimising contact. Again, some children will need you to assist them, maybe physically. They might need assistance with toileting or personal hygiene, feeding. But that's why such things as hand hygiene, respiratory hygiene, wearing of PPE is really important. Considering people who are at risk, whether it's our workers, our children, or volunteers. So creating opportunities for people who are not going to be able to volunteer in person is important too. Small groups. So at GAP, we have always kept our group numbers small because we find when there are too many children or too many young people, it becomes overwhelming for them. But our groups have gotten even smaller because of COVID-19. We are going to be outside as much as possible, and looking outside at the window at the moment with weather being the way it is, that doesn't sound like the nicest summer ever, but at least it will be safe. And then we have a much more extensive cleaning and sanitization routine. We're really lucky at GAP that we have a wonderful caretaker called John. If you're volunteering with us at the house, you'll be lucky enough to meet him. He's the nicest man and he keeps us running. We would all probably have contracted COVID and a lot of other things were it not for John keeping us safe. And volunteering safely. So as I mentioned, there's the COVID-19 information sheet and there's also the self-declaration questionnaire. So before volunteering at GAP, at least 24 hours, you fill in basically one of those forms you'll be familiar with to say that you do not have signs or symptoms or have been in close contact with a person with signs and symptoms of COVID. Constantly practicing hand hygiene and hand sanitizing. You'll see the points all throughout the house where you can sanitize your hands, practicing respiratory hygiene, social distancing, minimizing contact, and the use of PPE where it is appropriate for you to do so, where you can use it. This is the self-declaration. I'm not going to stay on that too long because you will all get a copy of that the week before you are due to volunteer with the camps. So we just ask that you fill that out and return that to us via email. And this is, again, a very brief video. This is actually a requirement of our volunteer training that we have to show you appropriate hand washing. I know this seems a little bit reductive. We all have been doing the 20-second scrub, but better just to have this out of the way. And it never hurts to have a reminder either of how to do it properly. If it works. Okay, it may not. So I might have to come back and actually find that video on YouTube and show it to you that way. I wonder if I, oh, that's okay, it's working. Great. So that is the steps which we are probably all very familiar with, but as I said, it's no harm to have a refresher. I think this generation is going to be experts at washing their hands. And beyond just the physical implications of COVID-19, we're very aware that there are mental health and well-being implications too. It's been a really difficult year and a half, 2 years nearly at this stage. It feels like a long time. It's been a really difficult time for everyone. And that is why it's important, the GAP, that we let you know that supports are available to anyone who's feeling anxious or stressed. I understand we could start back with the best of intentions, but the reality can be a little bit scary, and it's fine. It's very normal to have that kind of return anxiety. So you can speak to me either in my capacity as a COVID-19 compliance officer, if there's something that you are worried about in terms of COVID or any of our procedures or restrictions. If something's not working for you, you can talk to me, but you can also talk to me about your concerns, your worries. It'll be a confidential and non-judgmental conversation, and we do really value your feedback. Your recommendations are very important to us as well. There are very good resources that are available for coping with stress. If you would prefer to if you don't want to talk to someone but you're still feeling the stress, there are a lot of resources there. But yeah, I can't stress it enough. It's a difficult time, and don't feel like you have to suffer alone. So please do come and speak with me if you feel the need to, or if things are getting a little bit overwhelming. So now, as I said, we're going to talk a little bit about child protection. There are going to be a discussion of abuse and neglect, signs and symptoms. We're not going to go into great detail, but we will be referring to it. So our child protection policy is basically grounded in Children First 2011. We have a designated liaison person at GAP, and that's me. So you're familiar with me, you know my face. So I do hope that if you have any concern or questions regarding volunteering, but particularly regarding child protection and safeguarding, that you will feel confident coming and speaking with me. So it's my responsibility to ensure that GAP is meeting the requirements and standards laid out in our child protection policy and in the Children First guidelines. So what do we do if we have a concern or we feel that a child might be at risk of abuse or neglect? And, there are different ways to approach things, but overall, mainly it would involve, in more extreme circumstances, it involves contacting TUSLA, which is social protection, the duty social worker, or An Garda Síochána. I'm really happy to say that in my 4.5 years at GAP, there has never been a need to report to TUSLA, but we have to prepare as if it could happen tomorrow or today. We need to have this at the front of our mind at all times. we are working as a team and we are that child's number one cheerleader and protector while they're here at GAP. Their safety and well-being is always our number one concern. So if we have something that doesn't seem right, or we're a little bit worried about, or if we notice any of the signs and symptoms of abuse or neglect, it's important that we prioritize their needs and their safety. So that is what child protection is. It's recognizing, responding and reporting concerns about a child's welfare or possible abuse. And we do have online child protection training. It's the Children First training. But if you can't remember that training, just remember this. If you have a concern or an allegation or a disclosure of abuse or neglect is made, speak with me, the designated liaison person. I will then make the decision to report your concern, your allegation, your details to TUSLA or to An Garda Síochána and follow the GAP child protection policy. So if you haven't worked with children or this is unfamiliar territory, what are the signs and symptoms of abuse? What are the types of abuse first and foremost? There's 4 main types. Physical abuse we'll probably all be familiar with from the media. That's things like, domestic violence, bruises, fractures, swollen joints, burns, abrasions. Failure to thrive, which is a little bit harder to actually kind of describe. It's a child who is not developing as they should. Bites, poisoning. Sexual abuse, again, with the history that we have here in Ireland, with the tragedy that is clerical abuse, we are all more aware of sexual abuse than we ever have been before. Tragically, but at least now we know that this was going on and it was being covered up. So signs and symptoms of sexual abuse can include bleeding, abrasions, bruising, pain while using the toilet, infections, inappropriate sexualized behavior, or an unhealthy awareness of sex that does not match the child's developmental age. So a very young child having an advanced awareness of sex, that would be a sign of sexual abuse. It doesn't always mean, and that goes for all of these signs and symptoms. Sometimes there is an innocent explanation for any one of these things, and sometimes there is a more worrying explanation. Aggression, drug and alcohol abuse, self-harm, all of those can be signs and symptoms. Emotional abuse, again, that can be harder to pin down. Signs like withdrawal, unhappiness, anxiety, depression, reduced appetite, behaviours that concern or challenge us, tiredness, apathy, self-harm, suicidal ideation. And the really difficult thing for us as adults is I think all of those signs are also symptoms of mental health issues. So we don't always see these signs and go automatically that child is experiencing emotional abuse. They might come from the most loving, supportive background. They may have never experienced emotional abuse and they could still have those signs and symptoms. And that's why it's important that you share your concerns with other people, because we can gather more information. And then neglect. Neglect is sometimes considered to be the less dangerous of all the abuse, but it can be life-threatening. It can be fatal. So malnourishment, failure to thrive, medical needs not being met or addressed, a lack of adequate clothing, children being left alone without care, rejection, so not being appreciated or being loved or just emotionally validated as a child, inattention to basic hygiene, failure to attend school. And again, I think it's important to just reiterate, there are sometimes innocent explanations for all of these. Sometimes the explanation is not so innocent. And we are, first and foremost, always on the side of the child, there to protect them. So what do you do if a child actually makes an allegation to you? If they come to you, seek you out, and they tell you that they have been involved in abuse or neglect? That's a really scary thing to think about. It's something that I personally have never experienced. I've only ever done the training. It's something that I hope I never do have to experience, but I need to go into work every day prepared this could happen. So the advice that is kind of recommended by the experts: be calm and natural, same as you would any other day. Listen to what they have to say, give them adequate time, and don't rush them or stop them. Allow them to tell their story in their own language and don't ask leading questions. And an example of a leading question would be, did that person hit you at home? That's a leading question. You're giving them an answer in your question. So open-ended question is, where did that happen? You're not saying to the child, did it happen at home? Did it happen at school? Where did this happen? And it can be really hard to think of these open-ended questions when all you want to do is protect this child in front of you. And actually, generally try not to ask questions unless they're absolutely necessary for clarification, because it can be intimidating and overwhelming for children. This is really, really important. Do not promise to keep secrets. If a child comes to you and says, I need to tell you something, but I want you to promise that you will not tell anyone else, you legally and ethically can't agree to that, because if a child makes a disclosure of abuse or neglect, you have a legal responsibility to contact the designated liaison person and to ensure that that child is adequately protected. So if they say something like that to you, the best way to respond is, listen, I'm so glad that you came to me, that you trust me and you want to tell me something important. I can't promise that I will have to keep it a secret, because my job means that I have to do everything I can do to protect you. But if you still want to tell me, I would like to hear. And if they choose not to disclose, I know that's heartbreaking, but we have to live with that. And the other thing is, we can't make promises that we can't keep. We can't be another adult letting down a child. So once the child has finished their disclosure, thank them, reassure them that your feelings for them have not changed and that they've done the right thing in speaking to someone. And when you can, once they are finished and they've left, write down in their exact words what they said to you to the best of your recollection. If the child is leaving and you feel that the child is in immediate danger, as soon as they go home, they are at risk, you will have to call on Garda Síochána or the emergency services. Like I said, we have never had to do this, but it's important to remember, as a volunteer, that's part of your role. You can always ask the facilitator for guidance as well. Should we do this? I'm very concerned. I feel like that child is at immediate risk. And false disclosures are extremely rare. So in as much as possible, we believe the child. It is very rare for a child to make a disclosure of abuse or neglect that isn't true. And even in our own camps and clubs, we have to be mindful about what we can do to protect the children there. We do things, very practical things, like our ratios. Some children need one-to-one support. Some children can be supported in a bigger group. We, as volunteers, we reduce the time spent away from the group or alone as much as possible, and we always encourage the child to return to the group. Something like toileting and personal hygiene, a child and a volunteer can be very vulnerable in this situation. So what do we do? It's a fact of life that children need to use the bathroom. It's a fact of life that some of the children that attend GAP need support. So we know that adults will be helping them in the bathroom. So what do we do to ensure that we're protected and that they're protected? We encourage independence and only provide assistance when necessary. A lot of the children that come to GAP will not need assistance going to the bathroom. Some children might need to be reminded to use the bathroom, and that's it. They might need to be reminded to wash their hands, and that's it. If a child does need support, or if you need to supervise them for safety reasons, so say, for example, they go into the bathroom and they try and flood the bathroom, it happens. You might have to keep the door slightly open. All the locks in the GAP house can be opened from the outside. So if a child goes into the bathroom and locks the door, don't panic. It can be opened with a butter knife. If you do need to provide assistance, so say you have to help with nappy changing, or even just like pulling up a child's pants or buckling a belt or something like that, Ask a second volunteer to be present. Keep the door slightly open with one volunteer outside with their back to the door, and do everything that you can do to protect that child's dignity. One adult can't remain alone on the premises with a child or children. I've had it in the past where the group wants to go for a walk and one volunteer just does not want to, or one child does not want to go for the walk. And they say, it's fine, why can't I just stay here? Or the volunteer can stay with me. They can't, we can't, one adult can't remain alone on the premises. Similarly, if a parent is late to collect their child, there will always have to be two adults present with that child. We can't leave one volunteer or one facilitator with the child. Parents and guardians sign their children in and out of clubs so that we know that the child has gone home with the appropriate adult. We try as much as possible to have one-to-one supervision on outings and holding hands where age appropriate, because we know that that is a higher risk environment where we can't control a lot of the variables. So we try and mitigate that by having more volunteers present. And generally how our camps work is that a volunteer will be paired with a child or children. So the facilitator will say, okay, Sheila, can you work with Tommy today? Or Jimmy, can you work with Adam and Yusuf today? And that way then you will know which children you are keeping an eye out, who you're responsible for that day. But if in doubt, you can always speak to the facilitator and ask for assistance. Oh, this is in the wrong place. We took our break a little bit early, so I'm going to skip right through that. And actually, I think we've kind of covered the heavier stuff up front. So we'll give ourselves a little breathing there, and then we're going to move on to some of the lighter topics. These are some of the areas that if you're just generally interested in learning more about what happens at a gap camp, what autistic children can be like, this is what we're going to discuss now. And I'll try and keep this quite brief because this is a lot of information, and honestly, the best way you will learn this information is through experience. So we said earlier that autistic people communicate differently. Their communication is not broken, it's not poor, they communicate differently. You know, that is kind of like going over to France and saying, oh my God, these French people do not know how to communicate because they can't speak English. Which is ridiculous. A lot of French people can speak English anyways, but it's kind of like expecting everyone to talk the exact same language you do, with all the same inflections, all the same knowledge, and then when they don't, kind of going, oh, their communication isn't great. So, because just imagine if you were picked up and put in a foreign country where you don't know the language, imagine how scared you would feel. Imagine how difficult that would be for you. So autistic people will have different communication. Sometimes they might struggle with their receptive language, which is what they hear and they understand, and they might need extra time to process information. Sometimes they might struggle with expressive language, which is what they say or they express, and that means they might have trouble communicating effectively. So a child who is nonverbal might struggle with their expressive language. You might notice that some of the kids in our camps have echolalia, which is instances of sophisticated language that reflects repetition of dialogue heard in television or in the conversation of others. So let's just say, for example, my nephew, he's 3, he likes to repeat bits from the movie Cars. So that would be a type of echolalia. And again, so there's nothing wrong with echolalia. It's really nice, it's really pleasant. It's really soothing for the person who engages in it. But it might be confusing to you as a volunteer when you say something like, do you want to get your coat on? And the child goes, get your coat on. They might not necessarily understand what you said. They might just be repeating what you said. So repetition does not always indicate comprehension or understanding. So sometimes children might appear to have really good language, but they're actually repeating bits of what they hear around them. Sometimes autistic people can struggle with figurative language, such as metaphors, similes, and irony. Sometimes they might not understand sarcasm and some uses of humor. Other times they will be the most sarcastic people in the room. My nephew, my older nephew, he's 20, he used to ask me, are you being sarcastic right now? He would just say it outright because he wasn't sure. And you might notice that in the camps that the children might their language might contain unusual phrases, repetition, and out of context statements. And a lot of autistic people prefer to talk about their favorite hobbies or interests. No time for small talk. They don't want to talk about the weather. And I had a really lovely experience where I was supervising a online Dungeons and Dragons group. And there was a small number of children on it, all similar ages. And they communicated exclusively through references to TV, film, and books. So 1 minute it was Harry Potter, the next minute it was Lord of the Rings, the next minute it was Steven Universe, the next minute it was The Amazing World of Gumball. They were just throwing out these references. I didn't have a clue. I knew enough to know that they were referencing television, but I didn't know what they were talking about. But oh my God, they got on like a house on fire. So that is autistic communication. It's different, but it's great. And they make friends by talking about their favorite things, whether it's like Star Wars or Minecraft or Roblox or music or Hamilton the musical. It could be any of those things. That is how autistic people will make friends. So if an autistic person wants to talk to you about their special interest, you are really lucky because that means they like you. So another trick question, and I think you're all smart enough to know the answer. Does nonverbal mean no communication? No, of course not. Like we said earlier, nonverbal communication is valid. So I mentioned that sometimes people use apps, sometimes people use sign language, sometimes people use what's called a PECS book. It means a picture exchange communication system, which is a very fancy name for using pictures to communicate. And the example they have there is, I want green lollipops. So the idea is that a child will use these pictures and hand it to somebody else, the communication partner, to express themselves, to say what they want, how they feel. And we do have children that use PECS and apps in GAP. And also, you might have heard that autistic people tend to be quite visual learners. So visual supports can be really helpful. So things like having a picture of what activity is coming up next, having a plan written down, having something like a first then, which says, first we're playing with magnetic numbers and then we're going to play with the ball bounce. First we're going to play with Lego, then we're going to have our snack. Things like that. Just letting people know what's coming up next, making the unknown known really helps to reduce people's anxieties. Again, on that same note, using a timer. A lot of autistic children do not like transitions, and they really don't like when their favorite activity is stopped suddenly. So say they are playing with Play-Doh, they are in heaven, they are regulated, they're in sensory paradise. And I come along and say, okay, Play-Doh's finished, it's time for lunch. That child might not even be hungry. They are having their favorite item taken, cruelly wrenched away from them, and they're being brought to another activity that they don't want to do. And nobody warned them. Nobody gave them time to process that information. That child is not going to react well. If I have a visual timer and I say, first Play-Doh, then snack time, and then I turn my timer and they can see visually the passage of time, how much time they have left with their favorite object, and then maybe even a little countdown, okay? So Play-Doh is finished in 10 seconds, 10, 9, 8, da, da, da. And I use countdowns all the time with young people. Sometimes they work better than other times, but generally they're quite helpful for kids and they help them with those transitions. And again, just talking about the importance of recognizing people's communications, and all communications are valid. Even if a child has verbal language, if they are overwhelmed, they may not be able to communicate verbally. And Neil Katz is a nonverbal autistic advocate. He uses an iPad to communicate. And he has said, I've listened enough. It's time for me to speak, however it may sound, through an electronic device, my hands or my mouth. Now it's your time to listen. Are you ready? So once we actually quiet down, reduce our verbal communication, we will understand and learn that there is so much to nonverbal communication. And another area of concern for our volunteers is behaviours that challenge or challenging behaviour. I say behaviours that challenge, and I think I might have a slide that explains why. I'll just check that. But basically, a behaviour that challenge is when an individual doesn't have functional or socially appropriate methods of communication available. They will use forms that are considered socially inappropriate by others. That's a behaviour that challenge. Things like tantrums, crying, screaming, hurting themselves or others, aggression, destruction, grabbing toys, throwing, shouting, bad language, you name it. All of these things will be considered behaviours that challenge. And they can be really disruptive and difficult to handle, but they can be really effective too. And effective is generally good. If something is effective, we'll do it again. So as a volunteer or an adult working with a child, we might find that behavior challenging, but what is behind the behavior? What is the child trying to communicate with that behavior that they did not have the language or the communication to express to us? And as the more we support an individual to use their communication, whether it's their iPad, their voice, the pictures, sign language, gestures, noise, anything, the more likely we are to reduce the likelihood and risk of these behaviours. I know it sounds a little bit wishy-washy, but the number one way to reduce behaviours that challenge is to figure out what that child is trying to communicate and then empower them to communicate that another way. So when you're working with our kids, a lot of the time you won't have met them before, you won't know them. So you will get access to what we call our profile sheets. You will see these when you come into camp. So say you are paired with a child, your first order of business is to grab the profile sheet and find the child's name and check out all the need to know information. So we include things like their likes and dislikes, including things that they're scared of, a bit anxious about. We include things like medical information in the off chance that there's a medical emergency and they need medical attention. We need to know if they have any allergies, any dietary requirements, any medications that they are currently taking. What are their physical needs? Are they glasses wearers? Do they require a hearing aid? It's funny, you'll see a child and it might say, wears glasses at all times. And then you look up and the child is walking around, no glasses, and you're going, oh God, okay, did they come in? Did they lose them? Are they gone down the back of the couch? I must find these glasses. And then how do they communicate? We just spoke about how important it is. If they communicate using PECs, is their PECS book accessible to them, or is it locked up in a bag that they can't reach? Are they going to put small objects in their mouth? Do we have to do a little sweep of the room before they come in and make sure anything that's a choking hazard is removed? Really, really important bit of info. What helps when the person is upset? Because what might help one person might upset another person. Some children want to be hugged and squeezed and comforted when they're upset, and other children need as much physical space as you can possibly allow them, and they need complete silence. So if you use one approach and it's not the right one, that can be unhelpful for the child. Is the child a flight risk? Do we need to hold hands when they're walking? A lot of our younger children are, obviously, because of their developmental age. Do they have a reduced awareness of dangers? Things like traffic, insects, dogs, even strangers. So again, developmentally, a lot of the younger children will have a reduced awareness of danger. How much assistance do they require with toileting? As I said, we want to make sure for their own dignity and their independence that they are prompted as much as possible to go it alone. But if they do need help, we are there to support them. and in a non-judgmental fashion. Will they respond to their name or their verbal command? If you call their name, will they actually look at you? Sometimes autistic children won't, sometimes they will. And then really important again is to know if they have injurious behaviours to themselves or to others. So if that child is in distress, will they hurt themselves or will they hurt other people? Will they be verbally abusive towards themselves or other people? So we can be mindful of what happens before these behaviours. We can try and calm that child down. We can try and reduce the distress for them. And again, another important part of this and an important part of autism, in fact, the webinar that we did last night was called Sensory Processing and Self-Advocacy. It was very much focused on how sensory processing is like a core tenet of autistic identity. So thinking about how an autistic person, like in that video we watched earlier, they experience the world completely differently. Their perception is different across all of their senses. So knowing that some people are going to have a reduced sensitivity to environmental stimuli and other children are going to be really sensitive to certain environmental stimuli. And I could list it out, but I have to say, looking at the profiles that we've been getting in, the number one thing that most children are sensitive to is loud noises, loud, sudden noises. Things like hand dryers, babies crying, shouting. So I see that coming up again and again and again. And then we see things like kids that love being squeezed, they love deep pressure, they love movement. A lot of that is quite common as well. And it's important to know that every child will have a very different sensory profile, and every child will be a mixture of hypo and hypersensitive. The same child that cannot tolerate loud noises might love singing loudly because of the feeling on their vocal cords that it gives them, or the feeling in their ear, in their auditory processing that it gives them. So just because a child doesn't like loud noises doesn't mean they don't make loud noises. That's something I've learned. Something I think it's very important to touch upon is the infamous meltdown. And I said earlier that I was going to talk about the difference between a meltdown and a temper tantrum. So we know that autistic people experience sometimes significant distress relating to sensory processing, and also just in general, the stigma that they experience, the isolation, the exclusion, the difficulty of being autistic in a world that is not designed to meet your need is hard. So a meltdown is a physical manifestation of anxiety, fear, feeling overwhelmed, frustrated, and inability to communicate or to understand, sensory difficulty, all of that together. It's a huge, huge thing. It's massive, it's overwhelming, it's physical, it's emotional, it's cognitive, it's sensory. It is not a simple temper tantrum. And temper tantrums have their place. They are a valid form of communication, but a child will recover very quickly from a temper tantrum, and it does not have all these components that a sensory meltdown does. So what can you do as a volunteer if a child is experiencing a meltdown? Well, just try and remember how you would like to be treated if you were in that same situation. A child experiencing a meltdown is extremely vulnerable. They feel very, very at risk and raw. Even if their behavior is posing a danger to you or other people, they are still so vulnerable because they cannot control their behavior. They cannot control what they're saying. They are unable to stop that process. So if you were completely vulnerable at the whims of people around you who are bigger than you, how would you like to be treated? You'd probably like to be treated with dignity, safety, respect, and be made to feel comfortable. So what can you actually do? Reduce the noise, the language, and the stimulation. Calm the environment. Remove the other people from the location. So that has two functions. It keeps people safe physically, but it also reduces stimulation in the room. Try to use non-verbal communication. If you're trying to communicate something with your fellow volunteer or even communicating to a child, try and use your non-verbal communication as much as possible. So maintain a safe space for that child. So a nice cushy couch, beanbag, pillow, remove any items that can be thrown or might cause harm. During a meltdown, generally it's best to step back and allow physical space. Unless the child is seeking physical contact from you and they're looking for that physical reassurance, step back and give the child space. Most people, I don't want to generalize, but most people in meltdown prefer to have a little bit of space to breathe. It just, you can imagine if you're having a really difficult time, if anyone's ever experienced a panic attack, imagine someone hovering over you trying to help you. That could be really, really harmful and not kind of support you to feel your best. If you have to, for safety reasons, step out of the room and keep the person within view. So all the rooms in Gap, all the windows have, or all the doors have windows on them, exactly for that purpose. So if you need to step outside and give a child a little space just to burn off some energy or be alone, you can do that, but you can also keep them safe and keep an eye on them. And how do you know when they are ready to re-engage? Wait until they show signs like smiling, playing, interest in maybe things that are around them like books or toys, a calm demeanor, interest in other people. Sometimes after a meltdown, children can be kind of weepy and apologetic and they might be going, oh, I'm really sorry, I didn't mean to do that. Fresh start every time, blank canvas. I was speaking with a volunteer today, and if you're there, Alero, thank you. She had the most beautiful way of phrasing it, and I told her I was going to steal it from my training. She said, it unconditional positive regard, and I just thought that was so wise. The positive opinion and attitude that we have with the children that we work with is not conditional on their behavior. It's not conditional on their demeanor. We are not kind to the child that comes in. We're not only kind to the child that comes in every day full of love and friendliness and warmth. We need to be unconditionally kind to the little child that comes in who is hard to handle, who's a little firecracker, who's a little troublemaker, who is anxious or sad or angry. And I just thought that unconditional positive regard was such a beautiful way of saying it. And listen, I am human. That is hard. I've been trying to develop unconditional positive regard for decades. And I don't think I'm there yet, but I'm aiming for it. And I think that's all we can do as humans, is to aim for that really gorgeous standard unconditional positive regard. This is just a quick little document. I don't expect you to be able to look at it all, but I will share this with you. I'll upload it to our website. This is a really nice resource. It's used in schools, trauma-informed schools, basically acknowledging that children who act out or have behaviours that challenge, they are experiencing a trauma response. And discipline is not what they need. What they need is regulation, and they need support. So if a child is showing behaviors that challenge, chances are they're going to fall into these 4 categories of freeze. Freeze is when they literally freeze, go blank. There's nothing going on there. It's like they've gone into a different world. Flight is what it sounds like. They leg it, they run away, they try to escape the problem. Fight is again what it sounds like. They are aggressive, combative, defensive, shouty, pushy, angry, but they're on the inside scared little children. And then submit is just when you completely, you're the people pleaser trying to make everyone happy to feel safe. If I make everyone happy, I can get through today and I won't get in trouble. So we tend to see that a child who has behaviors that challenge, they fall into these 4 categories. And like I said, the response that works is never discipline. It's never shouting. It's never getting strict. It's never a timeout. It's meeting the child where they're at and trying to support them. Even the most heinous behavior, I'll always think of at the time I was facilitating a camp, and they were only little kids, so their social skills and their play skills are still developing. And one child wanted the toy car that another child had, and he just walked up to him, grabbed it, and pushed him over. So the victim in the scenario, we'll just call him the victim, was obviously very upset and started crying. I ran over to the victim. I comforted him. I went to the perpetrator. They're both toddlers, you know. So I went to the perpetrator and I said, oh my goodness, I don't think that was very nice what you did to John. You pushed him over. How do you think that felt? That must have hurt him. And immediately the perpetrator, the tears started flowing. And he's like, no, I'm not going to say sorry. I'm not saying sorry. And the victim recovered within 30 seconds. The perpetrator, I had to comfort for 20 minutes and be like, it's okay. It's okay. These things happen. I'm here with you. It's fine. And eventually, when that child was regulated, we were then able to say sorry. The original victim had forgotten what happened, but we all learned a lot that day. But the poor little things, like I said, sometimes, obviously that child who was doing the pushing was more dysregulated than the victim in that scenario. And the other lovely thing about sensory experiences is our children really enjoy unique sensory games. And I think you'll get to experience a lot of that in our camps, these wonderful sensory projects and arts and crafts. It's really fun and exciting. And again, as I mentioned, we talked about behaviours. I just want to quickly check. Yeah, no, I don't. So very briefly, the reason I say behaviours that challenge instead of challenging behaviours, it's very little difference on the surface of things. To me, it's the same as that identity first versus person first language. When I say behaviours that challenge, I am recognizing that there's nothing inherently wrong with this behavior. It's challenging to me. So just for an example, when we say that behaviors that challenge, we recognize that it's challenging depending on the environment that it happens in, okay? So if a person is training to be a boxer and they are boxing with their punch bag, that's not a challenging behavior. That's not challenging. It's appropriate. It's appropriate to the situation and the environment. If a person is defensive, scared and hurt and they start punching the person beside them and it's unsafe, that behavior is challenging. So same exact behavior, different context. Another example would be a teenager, when they come home, they want to take their pants off and walk around in their underwear in their room. In the privacy of their own room, that is appropriate, that is fine, it's not challenging. In the context of a shared space, it becomes challenging. So I always say behaviors that challenge because it automatically reframes how I think about the behavior and it takes the blame, I feel, off the person. And I learned that years ago from a really clever man who works in positive behavior support. And ever since then, I was like, that's genius. I'm going to say that from now on. And I just think it's more respectful towards the people that we work with. So things that we see as behaviors that challenge are, you know, the things we talked about: aggression towards others, self-injury, and then sometimes it's not directed at people. So like destruction of property, a lack of awareness of dangers. That's passive, but it can be challenging. Inappropriate sexualized behavior. So if the child is becoming a teenager or a young adult, we can see sometimes inappropriate sexualized behaviors. And I know this is probably setting all the alarm bells off, but what I will say is we see very low incidences of behaviors that challenge a camp. It happens. It definitely happens. It's a reality. It's part of the work that we do. But if we create an environment where a person feels safe, validated, and respected, and they can communicate their needs to us, when we create very clear boundaries and expectations, you can watch those behaviours that challenge go way, way, way down. So I'm not going to say that there are 0 incidences, but chances are there'll be a lot less than there are in school, because the children are generally more regulated and content when they're at our camps. So what can we do as volunteers and adults to prevent these behaviours, to help to prevent them? We can't prevent all of them, but we can help. As I said, allow for communication. Does that person have access to their communication aids, or is it useless and locked away in a bag that they can't access? If they come in with PECs or an iPad for communication, we need to make sure that they have access to it. Have they been given the opportunity to share important information? Some children are verbal and they want to tell you all the things that they've been bursting to tell you since yesterday. And if we dismiss them, that can be really harmful, can lead to behaviours that challenge. So give people ample time to talk about their favourite things. Does the person understand what's expected of them or what they can expect? So if a child comes and they're 4 and they've never been to a camp before and they don't understand rules, and this whole idea of sharing is very new to them, we really can't expect them to have that skill without development. So we need to set our bar a little bit lower. As the adults in their life, are we being consistent with those boundaries? Am I saying to one child, you have to eat your snack in the kitchen, and another volunteer is saying, that's fine, you can eat that in the sitting room, in the playroom, that's fine, or in the sensory room? You know, those inconsistent boundaries are really distressing for children. Are we supporting them during times of transition when we're using our timers, because we know transitions are tricky? Are we offering choice and empowering that person to feel in control of their environment? Again, a really great way to reduce behaviours that challenge is to give the person control. Let them choose what comes next. Let them take a break. Encourage them to take breaks. If you notice that they are starting to get a little bit anxious, maybe encourage them to take a break or get some fresh air or visit the sensory room. Allow them to hold on to an object that makes them feel safe and happy. I will never understand why adults are so fussy about, no, you cannot take that book on the walk with you. The book might cost €2. If it gets destroyed, it gets destroyed. It's fine. If it helps a child to feel safe and comfortable, they can take the book, they can take the toy, they can take the car, whatever it is. Allow them to process what's going on around them and be aware of the behaviours that happen before the big behaviour that challenge. So that would be things like a child getting a little bit anxious, nervous. They might start fidgeting, they might start making a certain noise, they might start moving more. It's different for every child. So we're really getting close to the end. I know it's just gone 9 o'clock. I think this is kind of self-explanatory. It's so important that you feel supported as part of a team. You are not there on your own. You should be getting the support of me, other volunteers, our facilitator. Share information about what works and doesn't work. Build upon that profile. If you notice that there are things that don't work for the child, change it in their profile. And if there is a behaviour that challenge or a meltdown and you do not feel confident dealing with it, ask the facilitator to step in. Have at least 2 people present to ensure safety, and be available to go through like a debrief. The facilitators will generally do a very quick debrief. What worked, what didn't work, what can we do differently next time? Set kids up for success. I think a lot of what we talked about today is about, again, I'm going back to that beautiful phrase, unconditional positive regard. Try and see and get the best out of the young people we're supporting, because why else are we doing this work if we don't want them to succeed? So we have clear, simple rules. We give praise for effort, because sometimes showing up has been a battle for that child. We give them choice. And another lovely phrase that I learned yesterday is Sarah Salvacci Hernandez, the autistic OT. She taught me to validate vulnerability. Validate vulnerability. If a child shows you They do not want to participate in an activity. They hate it. They're terrified. They're anxious. They're scared. Play-Doh makes them feel sick to their stomach. I do not want to eat that pizza. Validate that. Accept their no and just move on. Do something different. It's fine. Honestly, do you think I'm going to lose sleep at night if the child didn't complete their art project? I won't, and neither should you. You know, the important thing is that the child has fun and they feel good when they're there, and that they'll come back again next time. So if you accept their no, they're much more likely to come back to our clubs. And who knows, if you support them to feel safe, respected, and validated, and they know in their head, when I say I don't want to do something, that grown-up listens to me. Maybe they will feel comfortable slightly trying things out of their comfort zone. I've seen it happen like time and time again. I've seen a child give a firm no, and when we respect that, you can see gradually the barrier comes down with support and compassion. And be realistic. You know, look at the age of the children. There's certain things that young kids won't be able to do. There's certain things that older kids will not find entertaining, you know. Know what they're interested in, what makes them feel safe and respected. That's it in general. And then a few important points to remember from our training. Autism is one component of what makes a person unique. It's a really important component, and it's a very important identity. Autism can occur alongside other diagnoses, things like Down syndrome, epilepsy, dyspraxia, ADHD. That doesn't change how we interact with the person. It might change the supports and accommodations that we might have available for them. Know their needs and how we can support them. Communication and socializing can be really tricky, particularly if you've lived through a pandemic. But every single person wants to feel accepted and appreciated, and let's help people to make that happen. And very important, have fun. The kids that come to these camps want to be your friends. They want to play, and they're delighted to see you there. They love new people. They love adults. They don't like me because I'm yesterday's news. They want to see new volunteers. Autism is an invisible disability. Every child that you meet will be a beautiful, perfect child, because they are. And part of our role as volunteers is to empower people to be independent, confident, and content. And we know that autism means different, not broken. So different communication, behaviours, and social interaction. This is some of the feedback from our facilitators, that this is what they wanted our volunteers to know. So it was just to know the rules. We're not big on rules at GAP, but we have boundaries to keep people safe. So things like holding hands on a walk where it's age appropriate, eating in the kitchen, helping to tidy up, trying our best, and saying sorry when we hurt somebody. Those are our general boundaries. We supervise the children closely at all times, because even an independent child will sometimes need a little bit of emotional support or social support. That gentle push to try new activities. Remember what I said about validating vulnerability. When they say no, that is fine. We respect and we validate no. We validate consent from children of all ages, but we can support a child to go a little bit out of their comfort zone and try something new. And on that point, don't be afraid yourself to say no. Sometimes people say no and a tantrum or meltdown will occur, but that's not your fault. Just think about all the things that you can do to support a child who is having a meltdown. And no is unfortunately a part of life, and everyone says no. That's fine. Encourage independence. I think we talked about that quite a lot. Share your skills and experience with others. If there's something that you do better than anyone else, whether it's crocheting or baking cookies or playing the guitar, share that with the campers, because they will love it. If there's one thing that autistic people recognize, it's genuine enthusiasm and interest. That is like their love language. They can feel it coming off people, and they can recognize people who are ingenuine either. Disingenuine, that's the word I'm looking for. This really practical tip: check toilets after use, just to make sure if the toilet has been used that everything is clean and well taken care of there, because even an independent child might still make a bit of a mess. Remain with the rest of the group as much as possible. If the child needs a break, just let someone know that you're going to be with them. Help us to tidy up. And then also thank you. Our facilitators want to thank you so much for your dedication, kindness and support. And you'll be delighted to know that is the end of our volunteer training, and we're just gone 7 minutes over. But I would like to say, you know, anyone who has questions, please feel free to unmute yourself. What I'm going to do now is stop the recording so you don't have to appear on